She is in her first trimester when the wagon leaves Iowa, and she will not write a single word about it for 5 months. Amelia Stewart Knight walks beside her family's wagon in the spring of 1853, 7 children in tow, a husband beside her, and a secret she carries alone across 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain. She writes about rain. She writes about mud. She writes about her children's fevers and a daughter briefly lost and found. She does not write that she is pregnant until the day she gives birth. On the side of the road, one day after the family finally reaches Oregon Territory. For 5 months, a woman capable of describing the exact color of a sunset over the Sweetwater Valley said nothing about the condition that shaped nearly every hour of her journey. What kind of silence was that? And what does it tell us about everything else the pioneers chose not to say? This is the question at the center of one of America's largest peacetime migrations. Between 1840 and 1869, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people walked, rode, and pushed their way toward Oregon, California, and Utah along the overland trails. Most of them wrote letters home, many kept diaries, and historians who have spent decades reading both side by side have found something unsettling. The two documents do not always match. Consider what the journey actually demanded. Emigrants walked roughly 15 to 20 miles a day, most of it on foot, since the wagons were packed too heavily to ride in comfortably. The wagons themselves, small enough to be pulled by oxen, carried everything a family owned, and everything not essential was eventually abandoned along the route as animals weakened and loads had to lighten. Dust rose in choking clouds behind long trains of wagons. Water sources were often fouled by the very crowds trying to drink from them. And disease, not the dramatic river crossings or the feared attacks that later dominated popular imagination, was the trail's true killer. Historians estimate that roughly 1 in 10 immigrants who set out never reached their destination, with cholera responsible for a disproportionate share of that toll. In 1852, emigrant George Tribble recalled that for 400 miles the road was almost a solid graveyard, and that at one campground alone he counted 71 graves. Of the 10 members of his own family who started the journey west, only 5 arrived. If you're finding this kind of deeply researched history compelling, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to bring forgotten first-hand accounts like these into the light. So if death traveled with nearly every wagon train, why do so many surviving letters read like optimistic travel notes? Part of the answer lies in what letters were actually for. A letter home was often the only communication a family would receive for months, sometimes longer, and it might be the last correspondence before a permanent parting. Emigrants frequently wrote to reassure the people they'd left behind, to justify a difficult and sometimes controversial decision to migrate, and to preserve the hope that had convinced them to attempt the journey in the first place. Diaries, by contrast, were often private, written for the emigrant alone, or for a version of themselves who might later look back. The distance between those two forms of writing is where much of the trail's harder truths live. Amelia Knight's diary is a striking case study in that distance. She wrote in careful, often understated language about her family's daily progress, the weather, and the landscape. Historians examining her diary have noted that she recorded being too sick to cook on some days and unusually sensitive to the smell of dead oxen along the road, entries that read without context, seem minor. Read against the fact of her pregnancy, they take on a different weight entirely. She never explained why. She simply endured, wrote what needed to be written to track the journey, and left the rest unspoken, even to the pages meant only for herself. This pattern of selective disclosure appears across many immigrant writings, though not uniformly, and historians are careful not to claim it applied to everyone equally. Some immigrants wrote home with unflinching honesty about death and grief. Diaries and letters from the cholera years of 1849 and 1850 in particular contained direct, harrowing accounts of sudden illness and burial beside the trail. What varied enormously was how much emotional weight a writer chose to place on a page, and how much they chose to carry silently instead. What would you have written home, and what would you have left out? Let us know in the comments, because the answers people give reveal a great deal about what the pioneers themselves may have been weighing. There were also entire categories of hardship that letters rarely addressed directly, not necessarily because immigrants were hiding them, but because language of the period simply did not provide comfortable ways to discuss them. Childbirth on the trail, women's physical exhaustion, miscarriage, and the particular fear of raising infants and small children through months of dust, cold nights, and irregular food were subjects considered private, even indelicate, for correspondence that might be read aloud to an entire extended family gathered around a table back east. A woman who had just buried a child somewhere on the Platte River might write to her mother about the beauty of the mountains ahead. Not because the grief wasn't real, but because there was, in the etiquette of the era, no accepted way to fully put that grief into a letter meant for public reading. The physical toll was equally difficult to translate into words a family at home could truly grasp. How do you describe to someone who has never left a settled town the specific exhaustion of walking 20 miles beside oxen that are themselves starving, past the carcasses of animals that didn't survive the crossing before yours? One emigrant, J.G. Bruff, recorded in 1849 simply counting 150 dead oxen along a single stretch of trail, noting it was difficult to find a camping ground free of carcasses. That is the kind of detail that appears in a private journal meant to record what was actually witnessed, but rarely survives intact into a cheerful letter meant to reassure relatives that the family was managing well. And perhaps this is the real discovery hiding inside the historical record. It isn't that Oregon Trail emigrants lied to their families. Overwhelmingly, they didn't. It's that they made constant, quiet decisions about what truths their loved ones needed to carry and which ones they would carry alone. Amelia Knight finished her diary, delivered her son the day after arriving in Oregon, and lived for more than 40 years afterward, raising her family in the country she had walked 5 months and 2,000 miles to reach. She never explained in writing why she said nothing about her pregnancy until the moment it ended. Perhaps she never needed to. Perhaps the silence itself was the message, one final act of protection extended not to strangers reading a diary more than a century later, but to a family who needed her to keep walking and to believe, as she herself had written along the Sweetwater, that Oregon must be a wonderful country. If this kind of story is the kind of forgotten history you want more of, the like button and a subscription genuinely help this channel keep telling them.